Some of the richest, most powerful world leaders on Earth lived like they had absolutely nothing. These were men and women who had access to presidential palaces, state jets, million-dollar security details, and national treasuries worth billions. Everything money could ever buy was one phone call away, and they said no, not because they had to, because they chose to. What you are about to hear is not a story about poverty. It is a story about 5 of the most powerful people in modern history who looked at all that wealth, all that power, all that excess, and walked away from every single bit of it. Chapter 1. José Pepe Mujica. In 2010, a small South American country called Uruguay elected a new president. And the moment José Mujica won, the staff at the presidential palace began preparing. They aired out the grand rooms, they polished the floors, they readied the motorcade. He never showed up. Instead, the most powerful man in Uruguay drove himself down a dirt road on the outskirts of Montevideo, parked his rusty 1987 Volkswagen Beetle outside a small farmhouse, and walked inside. His wife was tending to flowers in the garden. A 3-legged dog wandered across the yard. This was his home. This had always been his home. And as far as Mujica was concerned, becoming president wasn't going to change that. The world had no idea what to make of him. Here was a man who now controlled an entire nation. A man with access to state funds, government aircraft, lavish state dinners, and a full presidential salary. A man who could have lived like royalty for the rest of his life. Completely justified, completely legal, completely expected. And every single month he took 90% of his salary and gave it away. To charities, to small entrepreneurs, to the very people he was elected to serve. What was left, the roughly 10% he kept, brought him down to the average wage of an ordinary Uruguayan citizen. He didn't do it quietly either, he did it openly, defiantly. Like a man trying to prove a point to the entire world. But what the world didn't know was what those 14 years had truly cost him. Before he was president, before he was a politician, before he was anything the world recognized, Mujica was a guerrilla fighter, a revolutionary, a member of the Tupamaros, an armed movement that robbed banks and fought the Uruguayan government in the 1960s and 70s. He was shot 6 times. 6 times, and he survived every single one. Then they caught him. What followed was one of the most brutal chapters in modern Latin American political history. Mujica was thrown into solitary confinement, not for months, for 14 years. He spent most of that time at the bottom of a well, isolated, starved, psychologically tortured. The military dictatorship that held him used him as a bargaining chip, threatening to kill him if the guerrillas outside kept fighting. He had nothing. For 14 years, he had absolutely nothing. And that changed everything about how he saw the world. When he finally walked out of that prison in 1985, something in him had been permanently rewired. The things that other people chased, the big houses, the expensive clothes, the status symbols, they looked different to him now. They looked like traps. They looked like the very chains he had just spent 14 years trying to break free from. By the time he reached the presidency, Mujica had already made his peace with simplicity. He wasn't performing poverty for the cameras. He genuinely did not want more than he had. His farm, his wife, his dog, his garden. That was the life. That was enough. But the tension wasn't gone. Not even close. Because the world was watching now, and the world was not comfortable with what it was seeing. Foreign dignitaries arrived in Uruguay expecting a certain kind of leader and found a man in worn-out clothes who offered them vegetables from his garden. World leaders who traveled with enormous entourages watched Mujica climb out of his beaten-up Beetle with 2 security guards and wondered if they had the right address. His own advisors begged him to at least move into the palace, just for appearances, just to project strength on the world stage. He refused every time. Then came the moment that stopped the entire world cold. A journalist sat across from Mujica and asked him the question everyone wanted answered. With all the power you have, with everything available to you, Nanu, why do you live like this? Why the farm? Why the old car? Why give away almost everything you earn? Mujica leaned forward, and he said something that no one in that room was prepared for. He said that he wasn't the poor one. The poor ones, he said, were the people who needed luxury to feel powerful. The people who worked their entire lives just to buy things they didn't need, to impress people they didn't like. That, he said, was the real poverty. The poverty of never having enough. The poverty of always wanting more. He looked around at his little farm and said he was one of the freest men alive. The clip went around the world. It was translated into dozens of languages. It was debated in boardrooms and classrooms and living rooms across every continent. Here was a sitting president, a man with the full machinery of a nation behind him, telling the world that their definition of wealth was broken. He wasn't poor. He had chosen something far richer than money could ever buy. And the world called him the poorest president on earth. He smiled every time he heard it. But Mujica wasn't the only world leader making that choice. Halfway across the world, the most powerful woman on the planet was doing her own grocery shopping. Alone. Chapter 2. Angela Merkel. For 16 years, Angela Merkel ran the most powerful economy in Europe. She negotiated with presidents. She steadied the entire European Union through financial collapse, refugee crises, and a global pandemic. When the world's most powerful men sat down at the same table, they watched her. They waited to see what she would do next. For over a decade and a half, Angela Merkel was arguably the most influential leader on the planet. And every evening she went home to her apartment. Not a palace, not a state residence dripping with chandeliers and gilded furniture. An apartment. The same apartment she had lived in before she became chancellor. The same address, the same building, the same buzzer on the front door. With her husband's name on it, not hers, his. The most powerful woman in the world didn't even put her name on the door. Think about what Merkel had access to. Germany's GDP hovered around $4 trillion during her tenure. She had state residences available to her. She had a full security apparatus, a government staff, every resource a head of state could ever need. She could have redecorated an entire palace and no one would have blinked. World leaders had done far more with far less justification. She just didn't want any of it. The first time photographers caught her at a supermarket, the images went viral. There she was, the Chancellor of Germany, standing in a grocery store aisle, basket in hand, picking out her own food like any ordinary citizen on a Tuesday afternoon. No entourage, no fanfare. Just Angela Merkel, deciding between options on a shelf, completely unbothered. It wasn't a one-time thing either. It happened again. And again. Staff at local Berlin supermarkets knew her by sight. She came in, she picked up what she needed, she paid, and she left. No performance, no cameras invited. Just a woman doing what she had always done before the world decided she was important. And it wasn't just her shopping habits that were raising eyebrows. Fashion journalists who covered world summits began noticing something unusual about Merkel. She showed up to major international events, G7 summits, EU gatherings, state dinners, when wearing the same jackets, the same colors, the same cuts, over and over again. One blazer appeared at 5 separate high-profile events across multiple years. The media counted. They made charts. They wrote entire articles about it. She never once acknowledged it, never once changed her behavior. She simply did not care. In a world where image is everything, where leaders spend fortunes on wardrobe teams and personal stylists, where a wrong outfit can dominate headlines for days, Merkel wore what she owned and showed up to run the world. But here is where the tension deepens. Because this was not a woman who didn't know better. Merkel was surrounded by people whose entire job was to manage her image. She had advisors, communications teams, and handlers who understood optics better than almost anyone. She knew exactly what the cameras would see. She chose simplicity anyway. Not as a political stunt, but as a genuine expression of who she was. She grew up in East Germany behind the Iron Curtain, in a world where excess was not an option and modesty was simply a way of life. That upbringing never left her. Even as she accumulated one of the most impressive resumes in modern political history, physicist, party leader, four-term chancellor, she carried East Germany with her everywhere she went. The weight of what she could have had was always there. Every day she walked into that apartment instead of a palace was a choice. Every supermarket trip was a choice. Every repeated blazer was a choice. And the cumulative effect of all those choices over 16 years said something about her that no speech ever could. Then came the moment that crystallized everything. In December 2021, after 16 years as Chancellor, Angela Merkel stepped down, and the world braced itself. Leaders who leave office at that level almost always do the same things. The memoir deal worth millions. The speaking circuit at $100,000 a night. The foundation, the global influence tour. The careful, lucrative transition from power to legacy building. Merkel announced none of it. She went home, to the apartment, to the quiet life she had never actually left. No book deal announced. No speaking fees reported. No dramatic reinvention. Just a woman who had spent 16 years at the center of the world and simply walked back to the edges of it without looking over her shoulder. That is almost psychologically impossible for most people who reach that level of power. The ego, the hunger, the need to remain relevant. It consumes almost every leader who ever held that much influence. They don't know how to let go. They don't want to. Merkel let go like she had been practicing for it her entire life. Because she had. The woman who never put her name on the buzzer was never really there for the power at all. But if Merkel's simplicity was quiet and invisible, the next leader on this list made his poverty a battle cry. From the top of a nation sitting on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of natural resources. Chapter 3. Evo Morales. Beneath the surface of Bolivia, there is an almost incomprehensible amount of wealth. Natural gas reserves worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The world's largest lithium deposits, the same lithium that powers every smartphone, every electric car, every piece of modern technology on Earth. Vast mineral reserves that global corporations had spent decades trying to get their hands on. Bolivia was, by any honest measure, sitting on a fortune that most countries could only dream of. And the man chosen to sit on top of all of it showed up to his first international summit in a striped sweater. Evo Morales became president of Bolivia in 2006, and from the very first moment he stepped onto the world stage, he made powerful people deeply uncomfortable. Not through aggression, not through threats. Simply by refusing to look like what they expected him to look like. He was a coca farmer, the son of an Aymara indigenous family so poor that several of his siblings died in infancy. He grew up without electricity, without running water, without any of the basic infrastructure that most of the world takes for granted. He herded llamas as a child. He played football with a ball made of rags. And then, against every odd imaginable, he became the first indigenous president in Bolivia's entire history. The stakes of that moment cannot be overstated. Bolivia had been ruled for centuries by a small, wealthy, European-descended elite that had systematically excluded indigenous people from power. from wealth, from basic dignity. When Morales walked into the presidential palace, he wasn't just making a personal statement. He was rewriting centuries of history with every single step. But Morales wasn't done making powerful people uncomfortable, because while other world leaders arrived at international summits in tailored suits flanked by enormous delegations, stepping off private jets onto red carpets, Morales kept showing up in that sweater. The same style, the same simple striped pattern that his people had worn for generations. Diplomats whispered about it. Fashion commentators wrote about it. Western media couldn't stop photographing it. His advisors begged him to dress differently, to look more presidential, to wear a suit just once, just for the cameras. The pressure was immense. When you represent a nation on the world stage, there are unspoken rules about how power is supposed to look. And a striped sweater did not fit the script. He refused, every single time, because that sweater wasn't a fashion choice, it was a declaration. It said that he had not forgotten where he came from, that the people who had put him in power, the farmers, the miners, the indigenous communities who had never seen themselves represented at that level, were still with him in that room. Every time he sat across from a world leader in that sweater, he was bringing his entire people into the conversation. And then came the real tension, because while Morales was projecting simplicity on the outside, the decisions on his desk were anything but simple. He was nationalizing Bolivia's natural gas industry. He was renegotiating contracts with some of the most powerful energy corporations on Earth. He was redirecting billions of dollars in resource revenue back into the Bolivian economy, building roads, schools, hospitals in communities that had never seen a single dollar of investment. The corporations were furious. Foreign governments were nervous. The Bolivian elite, who had always controlled the country's wealth, were watching their grip loosen in real time. The pressure on Morales was extraordinary, and the easiest thing in the world, the thing that happens to almost every leader who comes from nothing and suddenly controls everything, would have been to quietly start living differently, to let a suit appear in the wardrobe, to move into a nicer residence, to start skimming just a little from the enormous fortune he now controlled. He didn't. What made it even more remarkable was what he didn't do with the power he held. No offshore accounts were ever credibly linked to him. No sprawling personal real estate empire emerged. No mysterious family wealth appeared. In a region where leaders routinely used national resources to build personal dynasties, Morales remained stubbornly, almost defiantly, without personal fortune. Then in 2019, it all collapsed. A disputed election, allegations of fraud, military pressure, mass protests in the streets. In a matter of days, the man who had run Bolivia for 13 years was forced out of power. He fled the country with almost nothing. No financial safety net, no hidden empire to retreat to. Just a man and whatever he could carry. And here is the payoff that most people missed entirely. When Morales was forced out, his enemies searched. They looked for the corruption. They looked for the hidden wealth. They looked for the mansions, the accounts, the assets that leaders who abuse power always leave behind. They found almost nothing. A man who had controlled one of the most resource-rich nations in South America for over a decade had walked away with virtually nothing to show for it personally. The wealth he had moved was his country's wealth, and he had moved it toward his people. That striped sweater wasn't a costume, it was the whole story. But the next leader didn't just live like a poor man. He came from nothing, built a nation of over 1 billion people, and somehow never forgot where he started. Chapter 4. Narendra Modi. There is a railway station in the small city of Vadnagar in western India. It is dusty, unremarkable, the kind of place that most of the world will never hear about and never visit. Trains pass through it every day carrying passengers who barely glance out the window. In the 1960s, a small boy stood on that platform every morning selling tea. He was the son of a man who ran a tea stall to survive. His family had no land, no savings, no connections, no safety net of any kind. They lived in a two-room house with no running water. The boy woke up before sunrise, helped his father prepare tea, sold it to passengers through train windows, and then went to school. Every single day. That boy was Narendra Modi, and today he is the Prime Minister of India, the most populous nation on earth, a nuclear power, a $3.5 trillion economy. A country of 1.4 billion people whose military, foreign policy, and economic future sits in the hands of one man. The distance between that railway platform and the Prime Minister's office in New Delhi is not just geographical, it is almost incomprehensible. It is the kind of journey that should have been impossible, and yet he made it. But here is where the story takes a turn that almost no one expects. Because most people who travel that kind of distance, from genuine grinding poverty to the absolute pinnacle of national power, arrive at the top and exhale. They reward themselves. They build the life they never had. They surround themselves with the comfort and luxury that the journey denied them for so long. It is human. It is understandable. Almost everyone does it. Modi did the opposite. Officially on the asset declarations that Indian politicians are required to file, Modi owns almost nothing. No house, no car registered in his name. His declared assets place him among the least wealthy major world leaders on earth. A remarkable fact for the man running a $3.5 trillion economy. But what most people didn't realize was just how far Modi was willing to take this. His lifestyle is rooted in something deeper than politics. Long before he was a national figure, Modi had immersed himself in the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, a Hindu nationalist organization built on principles of discipline, self-denial, and service. Members of the RSS live by a strict code: simple clothes, simple food, no accumulation of personal wealth, no family of their own, complete dedication to a cause larger than themselves. Modi absorbed that philosophy entirely. He never married, he owned nothing, he needed nothing. And when he rose to power, that discipline did not soften. It intensified. There is a moment that captures this better than any speech or policy ever could. In 2024, ahead of a major national election, Modi undertook an 11-day spiritual ritual at a newly constructed temple in Ayodhya. For those 11 days, he slept on the floor. Not a modest bed, the floor. He drank only coconut water and ate the most minimal food permitted by the ritual. No briefings were scheduled, no political meetings, just a man, a floor, and 11 days of complete austerity. The images went around the world. Here was the leader of 1.4 billion people sleeping on a mat on the ground by choice, in the middle of one of the most consequential election years of his political career. The tension in that image is almost unbearable when you sit with it. Because this is a man who could snap his fingers and have any luxury on earth delivered to him within hours. The infrastructure of an entire nation exists to serve his needs. And he was sleeping on the floor, drinking coconut water, choosing discomfort as deliberately as other leaders choose private jets. But here is where the story becomes complicated. And the complication is important. Because while Modi's personal life reflects an almost monastic austerity, the projects he has greenlit as Prime Minister are anything but modest. A new parliament building, a grand Central Vista redevelopment in New Delhi worth billions of dollars. Infrastructure projects on a scale that makes the rest of the world take notice. The man who owns nothing has spent extraordinarily on the nation he leads. And that tension between the man who sleeps on the floor and the leader who builds on a grand scale is something his supporters celebrate and his critics cannot reconcile. But strip away the politics, strip away the debate, and what remains is a fact that is almost impossible to argue with. A boy who sold tea through train windows to survive now runs the world's most populous country. And after everything, after the journey, after the power, after the decades of political warfare it took to reach the top, he still owns almost nothing. The tea seller never really left that platform. He just brought the whole country with him, but nothing prepares you for the last man on this list. A president who ran an entire nation for over 2 decades and when it was all over went home to a farm and died with almost nothing to his name. Chapter 5. Julius Nyerere. In 1961, a British colony on the eastern coast of Africa became a free nation. It had no real infrastructure, no established economy, no blueprint for what came next. Just a people, a flag, and an enormous amount of hope resting on the shoulders of one man. That man was Julius Kambarage Nyerere, a schoolteacher from a small village on the shores of Lake Victoria. The son of a chief who had never been photographed, a man who had studied in Edinburgh on a scholarship and come home with ideas that were about to reshape an entire continent. He became the first president of Tanzania, and from the very first day he made a decision that would define every single day that followed. He would not steal from his people. That might sound like the bare minimum. It might sound like something every leader should do without being celebrated for it. But understand the context. Understand the world Nyerere was operating in. Across Africa in the 1960s and 70s, newly independent nations were falling one after another into the hands of leaders who treated national treasuries like personal bank accounts. Mobutu in Congo, Bokassa in the Central African Republic, Amin in Uganda. Men who looted their countries with breathtaking shamelessness while their people starved. The temptation for Nyerere was enormous. The opportunity was right there. And nobody would have been surprised if he had taken it. He didn't touch a single cent that wasn't his. But this was just the beginning of what would become one of the most remarkable stories in political history. Because Nyerere didn't just refuse to steal, he went further. He paid himself a salary that was deliberately modest, lower in some reports than what several of his own civil servants were earning. He drove himself in a simple car. He lived without the ostentatious trappings that other heads of state considered basic entitlements. He wore simple clothes. He ate simple food. He called himself Mwalimu, the teacher, and he meant it not as a title but as a description of how he saw his role. While other African leaders were building presidential palaces that rivaled European royal estates, Nyerere was turning down pay raises. The pressure on him was relentless. Foreign governments, international banks, and the IMF were all watching Tanzania, and many of them were deeply unsettled by what they saw. Nyerere had introduced Ujamaa, a philosophy of African socialism rooted in communal living, collective farming, and the idea that a nation's wealth belonged to all of its people equally. He was redistributing land. He was nationalizing industries. He was building schools and hospitals in villages that colonialism had completely ignored for generations. The Western financial world did not like it, not even slightly. The World Bank threatened to withhold funding. Foreign investors pulled back. Powerful governments applied pressure through back channels, through diplomatic visits, through economic leverage. They told Nyerere that his philosophy was naive, that it would destroy Tanzania's economy, that he needed to abandon Ujamaa and open the country up to the kind of capitalism that would make foreign corporations comfortable. Nyerere looked at all of that pressure, all of that leverage, all of those threats dressed up as advice, and he held his ground. What he didn't know was that the economic strain of those years would push Tanzania to the very edge. Droughts, falling commodity prices, and the costly war against Idi Amin's Uganda in 1978 had devastated the national economy. Tanzania was broke. The people were suffering. And the man at the top, the man who had refused to steal, refused to enrich himself, refused every temptation that came with power, was watching his life's work buckle under the weight of forces larger than any one leader could control. That was the moment most leaders would have broken. The moment the justifications start. The quiet transfer of funds. The insurance policy hidden offshore. The rational human instinct to protect yourself when everything around you is falling apart. Nyerere never flinched. Then came the moment that separated him from almost every leader who has ever lived. In 1985, Julius Nyerere voluntarily stepped down from power. Let that land for a moment. In a continent where leaders clung to power until they were removed by force, where resignation was considered weakness and retirement was something that happened at gunpoint, Nyerere walked away, on his own, by choice. He said that Tanzania needed fresh leadership, that no man should hold a nation hostage to his own ego, and that the greatest thing he could do for his country was leave. The world was stunned. He went back to his village of Butiama on the shores of Lake Victoria. He farmed, he taught, he wrote, he lived the same quiet, simple life he had always lived, as if the presidency had been a temporary assignment rather than the defining achievement of his existence. No memoir empire, no lucrative board positions, no global speaking circuit, just a man and his land and the people he had always belonged to. When Julius Nyerere died in October 1999, the assessments of his presidency were complicated. Ujamaa had not delivered the economic transformation he had dreamed of. Tanzania remained poor by global measures. Critics had no shortage of policy failures to point to. But when they looked at what he left behind personally, when they examined what this man had accumulated after 24 years of running an entire nation, they found almost nothing. No hidden accounts, no sprawling estate, no dynasty built on the back of public funds. A man who had held an entire country in his hands for nearly a quarter of a century had passed through power like water through open fingers, taking nothing for himself, leaving everything behind for the people who came after him. In a world where power almost always ends in personal enrichment, Julius Nyerere died as he had lived, with nothing. And that, after everything, was the whole point.